Hello and welcome back to the Series 3 re-chassis job onto a Maer galvanised chassis. You may well be thinking, why aren't I hearing Martin talking on the video? Instead, you're hearing voiceover. That is because the microphone decided to play up and it was the windiest day known to man, so the audio was pretty much unusable. Apologies for that, it does get better in the rest of the video. As you can see, the Series 3 does look a little bit different now. We've bolted a lot of the panels back on. Basically, it's reverse of removing them, so we didn't think it was worth the time videoing it all separately. The doors are original. They've just had the galvanised cappings flapped back to bare galvanised steel to match the new tub. As you can also see, we've done some painting. The paint, I'll explain a little bit later, was actually really old NATO green that Neil gave to me, and it's done a really nice job of sprucing it up a little bit. So it looks a little bit different. We haven't actually moved it on as much as it looks. The main focus on this is to do some wiring repairs. We've got a few little bits to connect up, and then hopefully by the end of today we can start the engine and drive the Land Rover, as well as of course fitting the Overdrive. The Overdrive turns out to be a little bit of a debacle, as you will see. One step forward, two steps back. But anyway, enjoy the video. Let's get started. So what we did when we were refitting all the panels is use new fixings, just standard 1/4" UNF nuts and bolts, and also stainless steel nut plates from YRM for the front wings. As you can see, the iconic worn 8274 has found its home on the front of the Land Rover again, and the V8's looking right at home, all plumbed up to the front panel with the radiator. Here I am just sorting out some of the wiring, feeding that bunch of wires down to the starter motor, and the brake pipes we've connected up to the master cylinder. I was so shocked and impressed at how well this military paint did. The number on the tin was actually, it's from 1993, so it's actually older than 30 years. And it just, as soon as I got it back into a good consistency, I rubbed the original paint down and just rolled and brushed it on, and it sort of healed over itself and gave a really nice finish. Aligning the panels on the Land Rover is enough to make a video in itself, and there's enough videos out there showing you how to do this that we decided to sort of skip over it on this occasion. We do explain it in the latest issue of Land Rover Monthly though, so be sure to grab a copy of that and you can see the procedure for yourself. It's one of those jobs that's not particularly exciting, but you want to spend the time because it makes the whole finished article so much nicer. But in the meantime, Neil's bringing the battery over to start testing the electrical system. If you cast your mind back to the first episode when we took this apart, you'll remember that we checked all the lights to make sure they all worked before we stripped everything around and disturbed the wiring. So now that we're putting the wiring back together with the new chassis loom connecting to the original bulkhead loom, we'll know hopefully all the lights will work. What we have done is got the vehicle's battery down there with a 20 amp fuse, so if we have got any short circuits as we're testing things, it will blow that fuse and won't damage any of the wiring loops. Really important to do that when you're reassembling a Land Rover, because the last thing you want to do is have a big melted mess behind the dashboard. Scraped off all the nice paint that I put on yesterday. How upsetting. Oh well. I've set about fitting the seat belts to the front of the tub, and Neil's got his multimeter out to check for 12 volts at the correct wire at the back for each light before he plugs them in, just to double check that all the wiring corresponds correctly. One of the upgrades that we're going to fit to this Land Rover as we rebuild it is an Overdrive, and if you've ever changed a speedo cable with an Overdrive fitted to a series Land Rover, you will know how to swear. So first of all, we're going to check that the speedo is working before we bolt the Overdrive on. To do that, we've jacked up the rear wheel and we're going to spin that wheel and watch the speedometer. It's fairly unlikely you'll get the back wheel spinning by hand quickly enough to see, but you can see the mileage on the odometer change as you turn the wheel. So now we're going to crack on with fitting the Overdrive, and to do that we need access through the top of the transfer box, which is this little rectangular plate with 4 nuts, and we need to take the circular plate off the back of the transfer box as well, which is this ring of nuts here. The Overdrive will then fit on the back of the transfer box, and the selector for it will bolt to these 2 bolts here. So whip those 2 bits off, and then we'll carry on. Just unbolting that circular rear plate from the back of the transfer box now. You want to keep hold of all the nuts and washers that you remove at this point, because they are used to hold the overdrive onto the back of the transfer box. It's quite often the studs will unwind from the casing rather than the nut coming off the stud. If that does happen, don't worry too much. Just gently grip the stud and wind the nut off, and then refit the stud to the transfer box by locking two nuts together and nipping them in. Right, so we've got all the nuts off this plate here, and now the plate will come off the back of the transfer box. Obviously, it's been on there quite a while, so it might take a bit of persuasion. I should probably... Oh, there she goes. That was easy, wasn't it? There we go, and that's where the overdrive will fit. Now that top cover and the rear circular plate are removed, we use this special tool to undo the nut on the back of the main shaft. Once that's off, the gear that will be replaced by the overdrive can slide off the end of the shaft. So here we go. This one was not very tight, it must be said. So once you wound that off, there's the nut, and then behind that is a lock washer, which looks like this. Come on. There we go. That's the lock washer. And once that's off, this gear slides out. Just like that. And it's that gear that will be replaced by the overdrive. Right, so we're going to fit a Fairey overdrive to this Land Rover, but what I would suggest is, if you're looking to fit an overdrive, don't bother with a Fairey, go and get a Roma drive from Global Roma, because they are so much better. However, I got this in a deal and I've got nothing to lose, so we're going to put it on. But if you are going to buy a second-hand Fairey, what you need to look at is this. This is the clutch sleeve. And as you can see, it's got all these little teeth on it, like a spline. And they engage in a female spline inside the overdrive. And when these wear, you get a load of slack, and that contributes to some of the famous overdrive noise. So you want to slide the clutch sleeve inside the overdrive and then just check to see how much it rocks back and forth. This one's actually pretty good, so I think we'll be okay to use this. But just a little top tip, if you are going to buy a second-hand overdrive. So I'm just putting anti-scuff grease all inside the overdrive here on the teeth splines, and then we'll wipe some around here as well. This is drilled for oil, but any extra lubrication is good, especially given how notoriously noisy these overdrives are. So this is that gear that we just looked at, which slides into the overdrive. So this goes in place of the gear that we removed from the transfer box. So we just get it in, slide it onto the gearbox shaft, like so. And that will be retained by the same washer, lock washer and nut as the gear that we took off. Right, so we've got the clutch sleeve on the back of the gearbox. Now the overdrive can be slid into position and secured. The overdrive's on. We've gone around, tightened up all 6 nuts that hold it to the back of the gearbox. This plate is on with the gasket, so now we can fit these 4 nuts, and that's, well, 3 nuts and a stud. And you'll also see that I've already run a breather, which I'm going to plug into a 90-degree fitting on the overdrive, which will help it breathe better and hopefully stop it leaking quite as much. So I cannot easily down. Yeah, Before we get too carried away and put the seat box on, we're just going to out the filler bung and put some oil in the overdrive. So, crack that loose. This is actually, as well as a bung, a little dipstick on, so you can check your oil level. So we need 0.4 of a litre according to the instructions of EP90. So get that in there. And use your dipstick. See how much? Yeah, we're not on there yet, so carry on going. Right, so we've undone the 2 bolts that go through the top of the gearbox here, and this is the new selector bracket, which I got off a seller on eBay. So fit the new bolts and basically bolt it onto the back of the gearbox housing. And that's what the lever that comes through the floor pivots on, just there. This is the rod which actuates the overdrive, and this is the pivot which has the overdrive lever, screws into the top, and how you select it through the floor. So next up, we're going to attach the rod to the pull on the overdrive, which is straightforward enough. It's a little pin which passes through there, and then a washer and a clip. And then we'll do the same the other end. That's that one. This is actually a greasable bolt. You can see it's cross drilled there. It's got a grease nipple on the end. So when all this is in place, you can grease it through the floor without taking the whole lot apart. So I'll loosely fit this, and then that goes on there. Like so. Right, we've had a bit of lunch, we're feeling good. So now the overdrive is all in place and complete. We can fit the seat box. And you'll notice that the seat box is the only bit I haven't had time to paint, so you'll have to excuse that. I'm going to get to it later. So look, there's no roof, should be easy. Let's get on with it. To me. Doing that again, are we? Got it? Yeah. Over the... Oh, I haven't changed the gator.
Oh no!
Oh no!
So
Let it.
You can do that afterwards. You won't go in without it.
All right.
Is the handbrake on or off?
Yes.
There's a high-low lever in the way.
That's it. There we go. Right. What's it snagging on now?
Oh, it was on that.
Oh, right, okay, cool.
Somebody fitted a grease nipple onto it.
Sort of roughly in there, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Well, you need to put the gasket in there, butyl.
Oh, yes. This stuff here is a roll of butyl sealing putty, otherwise known as dum-dum. And what this does is it sits between all the joints on the floor, seat box, tub, and isolates the two metals, and also, in theory, keeps water and mud and things like that out. So before we bolt anything up, we're going to run a strip of this along each seam. That way, when we put it together, hopefully, it will seal up. The seat box is now in, which means the battery can go in, which means we can then run the power cables and hopefully, before it gets dark, go for a first start. So, there we go. And then I've got a new earth. We'll probably use that instead of this. And then run the main feed up to the starter motor. Originally, the battery was just earthed down to the seat box. You can still see the old earth cable there, but we're adding an extra earth that runs down to the chassis as well, which should help with stronger starting and just overall electrical reliability. We've run the power cables, we're almost ready to start for the first time. But first, obviously, when we removed the engine, all the fluids came out. So to top up the coolant and top up the engine oil. And then what we'll do before we actually start the engine is crank it over to build oil pressure so that all the bearings and everything have a nice lubricating surface before we spark it up for the first time. So get the antifreeze in first and then move on to the engine oil. Okay, so we've connected the battery with a fuse in between just to check the ignition comes on and all the lights still work, which they do, so that's a good sign. Now we're going to connect the battery for real, crank the engine to build some oil pressure, then we can plug in the coil and the fuel pump and hopefully it will run. Ready for a crank? The moment of truth is here. We need to prime the fuel system, just run the ignition on for a bit, and then once that's filled the carb bowls up, we can start for the first time. That ticking noise is the fuel pump drawing the fuel up. As you can see, the filter's full. Give it some choke. It was at this moment we realised something wasn't quite right. The Land Rover would select all the gears and the transfer box definitely wasn't in neutral, but for some reason it wouldn't move, which was obviously a bit disconcerting given that it drove fine before we took it to bits, so a little bit of investigation was needed. Remember that Overdrive we fitted earlier? Guess what? It doesn't work with that gearbox because the gear on it is smaller than the one we took out. So we've just taken the transfer box apart again and refitted the original gear. Now the Land Rover should drive. And it's dark, but at least the lights work.
Hold on. Question? Right forwards. On your phone, pal.
So as you've seen from the picture a second ago, the gear that we removed is actually larger in diameter than the gear on the end of the Overdrive, which suggests that Land Rover has an Ashcroft's high ratio gear set in the transfer box, which I didn't know about. Anyway, the Land Rover's back together, running and driving, and we can tuck it away, ready for the final instalment, which you'll see here on YouTube and of course in Land Rover Monthly magazine. See you then.